supporting all the work that they do with respect to security and privacy, raising awareness and getting people and companies to take action. And I get to stand. Look at that. I'll stand. I prefer to stand, if that's all right. All right, so here we are. We've had a full day. We're coming up to the end here, so before Kelvin's closing remarks, just a few more conversations, and I'll call it operationalizing privacy, if that's all right for everybody. We've spent the day talking about what privacy means, and a lot of it's been around regulation, laws, and getting companies to do the right thing. So the question is, are the companies going to do the right things? Are they going to protect us, protect our privacy, or are we going to see a different outcome? And so we're kind of looking into the future here. So I know my co-founder, Marco Ciappelli, is joining us online digitally from Italy. He's not able to join us here today. He and I like to turn on our ITSP magazine time machine to kind of look into the future a little bit. And we're going to do that here today to kind of figure out where privacy is heading beyond compliance and how can companies and citizens take action. So Marco, flip the switch, turn that time machine on, and let's go. And my fellow time travelers today are sitting here. We're going to take a journey and navigate privacy. Have each of them introduce themselves, starting with Ben, please, on the end.
Sure. I'm Ben Moskowitz. I'm from Consumer Reports. I head up our digital rights program called the Digital Lab.
Kalinda Reyna, head of global privacy at LinkedIn.
John Gevertz, the Chief Privacy Officer at Visa.
Kristina Bergman, founder and CEO of Integris Software.
All right, well, thank you all. I know we're going to have some questions at the end, so get them ready. This is the panel to ask them of. Really, to kick things into gear, I mean, let's look at the scale and the speed of these regulations that are coming out. How do companies get a grasp on it? I know some of the previous panelists touched on some of these points, but we'll start with companies first, and then we'll look at the consumer end of it. How do companies get a handle on this? Where do they start? Do they just dig into GDPR and hope for the best, or do they go with CCPA, or is there a whole different approach that companies should be looking at?
So I think for companies, one of the things we've seen develop over time is the profession of privacy and the fact that companies are beginning to build out privacy teams. And those are often lawyers who are sitting down and reading these laws in their entirety. And once you've read the laws, the next step really is to go out and talk to other people in the company who are going to help you to implement those. So I think what we're beginning to see is that while it takes the lawyers to interpret these laws, it takes a whole host of people within a company to actually get the work done and to put these into operation.
And I certainly agree with what Kalinda said, but I think if we are in a position where we are looking at each new law as it comes down the road and trying to comply with it, we're behind the curve already. If you come from a company where trust is a core value, and it has been, and you attempt to build on that value, you build on that foundation by making sure that you are protecting consumer information, by making sure that consumers have the right knowledge and ability to control the information that you collect about them, you're going to be in a better place as you strive to comply with just the vast number of new laws that we're facing. It's at a faster pace than any of us that have been doing this for a long time have ever seen. We have GDPR, and it was only, 19, 20 months ago now. CCPA is almost a month old. We can celebrate the month birthday in 3 days. And there's more and more that we have to do. So building a program, as Kalinda indicated, that covers the spectrum of values that are inherent in any company and inherent in a consumer-focused or individual-focused approach, I think is critical.
Something we've seen in +1 on both comments, something we've seen a number of companies do is put together a governance council for GDPR and CCPA that spans lots of working teams. It usually includes the CISO, the CPO, head of risk, head of governance, head of lines of business, and occasionally the CEO themselves. And typically each of those heads owns a work stream, which is a component of compliance with these privacy laws. Obviously, the privacy team owning the legal side and interpreting the laws and helping translate that into business operations. But, the data governance team, how do you understand your data in order to comply with this and know what you have? The security team, how do we operationalize the controls that we then take from the data governance team and then implement with the security tools? And there's a whole continuum that we see go down the line, but we have yet to engage with a customer that doesn't have multiple teams across multiple divisions working together, and very senior leaders across the entire team heavily invested in figuring this out and making it part of what they do on a day-to-day basis.
I don't know, Ben, if obviously you're looking at this more from a consumer perspective, but do the consumers care whether it's led by compliance or not?
Well, I think a lot of what we've talked about today, ideally a consumer would never need to think about. We handle that complexity for them. But I do think that consumers care to the extent that privacy is a social issue, which I would argue it is. I saw a poll that said that consumers think that privacy is the most important social issue by plurality. So 65% of people in this poll said it's the most important issue they want companies to address. It's above climate change and everything else. I wouldn't go that far necessarily, but they clearly do care. And I think that they want to be able to trust that companies are doing the right thing.
And so are they looking for we're CCPA compliant or GDPR compliant on websites and in applications and products?
Probably not yet.
Yeah, I think it goes more to what John's point was, which is an expectation that the public's beginning to have of companies in the way in which we act, the way in which we talk about these issues and the way in which we think about these issues, and that the law is not the first thing that is prompting us to do the right thing. The companies, similar to Microsoft, similar to LinkedIn and Visa and other companies, are already thinking about these issues, have the framework in place, and are in some sense ahead of the laws because of the way that we've built our systems, the way that we have talked to our workforce about these issues, and just the underlying values that the companies hold and stay true to. And I think that's sort of a shift consumers have to make, is beginning to evaluate companies on those things rather than just privacy policies, which we've heard from other panels are long and hard to understand and often say things that are often frightening. It's really getting consumers to take a more active role in evaluating the companies they're working with.
Right, and just to add, when it comes to CCPA, as we know, it's new, it's brand new, and it's not clear to a consumer how you exercise these rights. So we know that CCPA right now is a bit of a first draft, we're all learning. I think that it will be interesting in the future to see if there are trusted intermediaries or tools that can help consumers exercise rights like the ones granted to them under CCPA.
Yeah, and what I'm really trying to understand is, and clearly some of the large organizations have the benefit of a culture of building trust, right? And the resources to build out platforms and processes and teams to actually ensure that that happens. And it's essentially a culture. I know one of the things we want to talk about is the culture. How does a smaller company faced with the onslaught of these things where security and privacy are kind of second nature, they're just focused on their business, how do they begin to build that culture with privacy and security first and trust at the core of what they're doing?
So I think it begins with setting the values of the company from the beginning. I think for a lot of startups, there is a point at which you're making a choice about how much data you're going to take in and how you're going to use it, and actually whether or not you're going to make the choice of doing the hard thing with that data. And I think a lot of this also comes down to the Silicon Valley at the point of going and getting additional rounds of funding, at the point of deciding where that company is headed. Some of those advisors actually asking the questions about how did you think about data? How did you think about what you're doing here? What are your corporate values around that issue? And I do think that when companies are being acquired, that is something that is being looked at. So I think that that's beginning to happen.
There's actually a very real story I can tell. And I will not tell you which company this is for reasons that will become clear. But basically there's a large organization that's one of our customers. They acquired a smaller company, and during that acquisition, they were a tech startup. During the acquisition, the executive team and board made all sorts of attestations about what data they have, what data they don't have, what kind of personal information is there. And for anybody, I used to work as a venture capitalist before this. For anybody who's kind of been in that world of M&A knows that attestation around privacy is getting longer and longer and longer and longer as acquiring companies want to know more and more and more about the data that's going to be coming into the system. And so this company, when they acquired the smaller company, the board, the executive team said, no, we don't have anything we shouldn't have. It's all good. Don't worry about it. Jedi mind trick. This is not the bad data you're looking for. And post-acquisition, they dumped it into their Hadoop cluster. And big data technology, Hadoop, is typically a dumping ground for all sorts of things. Everything just ends up in there. No matter how locked down it is in another system, it ends up in your Hadoop cluster. And we came in and ran a scan through their data set, and we said, did you know you have adult content? And the CTO was sitting there with his jaw hanging down looking at it. And we showed him a couple of examples of what was there sitting in his Hadoop cluster. And the chief privacy officer was sitting at the back of the room, rocking back and forth, smiling, having an I told you so moment, because they had been pounding the table of, we've got data we don't know we have. We need to find out what's there. If we get breached and it's out there, we're liable. Our brand is at risk. Our reputation's at risk. We need to know what's there. And this was her I told you so moment. And after that, it was, okay, well, where exactly is it? Which data set? Who put it in there? You know, the forensics that go back. And the reason that becomes relevant is not just in terms of risk profiling, in that the risk of the small company becomes the risk of the big company, which is a much bigger number when it's the big company, but also in terms of, in the event of a breach, you're probably also going to get hit with any kind of privacy law violations that are in there along with that breach. And so I do hear a lot from folks of, you know, there's only 3 people in California that are going to be enforcing these laws. And I think, okay, well, maybe for now, but also guess where they're going to start? They're going to start with A, publicly known offenders, and B, they're going to start with people who get breached and go and look at them for privacy violations. So you really need to have your house in order.
You know, I think it's a great story, and I think...
You cringe?
Never. But I also think it goes back to, going back to the initial question, your initial comments. Small companies are not necessarily going to have those huge compliance departments, legal departments, auditing functions, and the way that they get to where they need to is also to have it cultural and to be looking at not the size of the organization, but to look at some of the tools that we all use and the approach that we all have and the ethical considerations that we have. So you do your data mapping, you do privacy by design, you think about what data you're collecting, how you're using it, do you have the right controls around it, because that's how even a small company can be effectively manage privacy risk.
I think all this is a way of saying there's no time like the beginning. You know, if you're an entrepreneur today, I would think of, you know, dealing with privacy as a form of technical debt that's going to get more expensive the longer you go on. And it feels a bit like if you're a new company starting today, you can afford to not be reactive in the way that a big company needs to be compliant. You can do privacy by design and maybe find some white space in the market to create a product that's maybe differentiated and really appeals to what we think is a growing consumer sentiment and a need and a want for privacy. We're working with the Omidyar network actually on this exact question. We're doing public opinion research, we're doing surveys, trying to find in what categories, if you do a forced ranking of the things that make consumers pick their products, in what categories might privacy be near the top, such that if you can really differentiate your product and say, this is a much more private product, that will make the difference in the marketplace. So I think that's a really interesting place to be if you're an entrepreneur today, is thinking about to go into your time machine and 10 years hence, what's the kind of world that we're living in?
Well, when we say privacy by design, I'm not going to let anybody off the hook here. What the heck does that mean? How did we do something with that? I mean, I kind of know, and it's security by design. We see movements like DevSecOps. Do we need to see a DevPrivOps movement?
So I think privacy by design means different things to different people in an organization, and that's a good thing, because really what you want is everybody in the organization to see it as part of their job. So I think from an engineering standpoint, it means applying engineering principles to product problems to find out, how can we do this with less data? How can we anonymize this data? How can we find ways to isolate it so that only certain people have access to it? So thinking through some of the engineering techniques. I also think it applies to product, and I think product people thinking before they put something out on the market, working with the engineers and the lawyers, but also thinking themselves, is this a product that people are going to react to in a way that makes them uncomfortable? Is this something that does a good action and helps people solve a problem and gives them options for thinking of how they want to protect their privacy, rather than just putting out the product and not thinking through ways to help people control their data? So I think actually within an organization, everybody plays a role, and that's something that I try really hard in my role to get across throughout our organization, is that privacy is everybody's job, and it is really everybody's job to be thinking about it from a design perspective. Even if you're someone sitting in the finance department, there are pieces of what you do where you may not need all the data you have. You may want to make sure that only certain people in your department have access to it. So having everybody think about it in the way that they do their job.
I couldn't agree more. And so certainly, but this is also an area where a larger company can distinguish itself from some of the things that smaller companies can do, because everybody should be doing privacy by design and building it in, as we do in security by design, in the earliest stages of thinking about development. As we're doing agile development and we're doing our sprints, everybody has to understand concepts such as data minimization, data transfer, et cetera. But you also need, and I think to support this culturally, having operational processes that reinforce that. So having formal PIA processes and reviews that make sure that those steps have been undertaken and the right mitigations are put in place where they're needed. And one of the things that we also do at Visa is we have a cross-functional data use council with senior executives from across the business, where we take, if it's a new kind of use of data, if something that we haven't done before, we're looking at that. It comes to that council and looked at from that perspective. Is it, not only is it the legal thing to do, because we have lawyers, we can answer that question, but is it the right thing to do? Does it embody the values that we try and get across about security, consumer control, providing value to consumers?
Right. I mean, there are probably forms of data collection that the consumer doesn't want, need, expect, does not enhance their product experience. I'm thinking, for instance, of an antivirus that might sell your web browsing history. There ought to be some lines drawn, I think, as Julie put them, where we can say, you know, this is more about the business interest of the company, about building a good experience, which is, you know, how the market ought to work.
And I was just going to add on, I agree with that idea of lines drawn, and I think that is something that any company at any stage can put in place, is where are the lines of what we're going to expect. The other thing that I might be a bit controversial in just arguing for is that I think a lot of what we've heard today is a resource constraint around people who do privacy. And I think one of the things we need to start thinking about with privacy is that it's not just the people in this room who should be doing privacy. We need to be training the future workforce to think about this issue, even if they are not a lawyer or a privacy engineer or someone else. We need everybody to be actually having a baseline understanding and expectation, to your point, of what is that line as a society that we will not cross, and to be educated at some basic level about that. When I was in law school, privacy wasn't even a topic of discussion. There were no classes on privacy. Undergraduate programs today don't have any discussion on privacy. MBA programs don't have a discussion on it. And I do think if we're in your time machine and we're thinking about the future, and our expectation is that even at a startup level people can do this, we need to be training more people to do this work.
Well, it's easier at the startup level. I think if you have established systems and processes and a culture that doesn't embrace trust and privacy, it's probably even harder. So how, maybe looking at both angles, how does a company that is dealing with building a culture of that's surrounding privacy, how do they do that? Is it top down? Is there a champion inside that isn't at the exec level? And then maybe from an SMB startup perspective, how do they lead that culture establishment, if you will? Who leads it?
I'll jump in. It's got to be both. It's got to be bottom up and top down. I mean, at Visa, we're fortunate enough to have leadership, and our CEO was just speaking on data values very publicly, and that's a great place to be, and that people in the company understand that. But at the same time, it's also making sure, and Kalinda, your point about training, it's people that are coming up, the people that we're hiring. It's awesome if they have a background in understanding these issues. I think we have a cultural understanding more and more around breach and the implications of losing data. I'm not sure we have that same cultural understanding around these other concepts about data collection, about transparency, and so forth. So making sure that we're having those conversations both within our companies and at events like this, and at events that are much broader, that aren't only geared to privacy professionals.
And maybe as you answer, if you can make some examples. Do you run campaigns inside? Do you have data privacy days or weeks or luncheons or whatever? I don't know, any examples you can share as well?
I was just going to comment on John's point that I think, it really depends a bit on whether it's top down or bottoms up on your culture within your company as to what works best. But I think some of I actually teach a course on how to build a culture of privacy, and some of the things that I think have been most effective is getting people, again, not the folks in this room, but impacting the people outside this room to understand how privacy impacts their daily life. So for example, at LinkedIn this week, we are celebrating Privacy Awareness Week. We had an event yesterday for parents at LinkedIn on how to protect your kids' privacy. We have events on how to protect your identity. We do events in our India office around the India privacy bill and some of the biometric data that's being collected in India. So trying to make it relevant to the employees in their own lives so that as they do their job, they recognize the importance for the people they serve.
And how about from the consumer perspective? Obviously, Data Privacy Day, Marco and I, we joke, it's not a day, of course, not a joke. It's every day. We need to think about this. So what additional things can we do for consumers, either from the business or in the communities, perhaps?
One thing we've seen a lot of our customers do is use it in how they talk to their customers. So talking about the values of privacy, communicating that clearly. And I think you guys heard on the last panel, it's not uncommon for us to hear companies using it as a differentiator. You know, oftentimes you'll hear Facebook compared to Apple in their approach to privacy and what that means in terms of consumer trust and people's willingness to share their data and put more of their lives in the hands of those companies. And so I think a huge component of it is making it part of your storytelling externally. It obviously has to have basis in what you're doing internally, but we're finding more and more people are using that as part of their pitch to customers of why they should do business with them, why they should trust them, why they should share more data, and get products and services from them.
Take it one additional thought is we all strive to make sure that we develop our consumer-facing materials, whether it's our websites and so forth, to make them as good as we possibly can, as transparent as we can about our data uses, and provide the rights that are appropriate under GDPR, under CCPA, and so forth. But I think it's also incredibly important to have discussions when we have industry groups and in industry meetings, to have discussions not only about, hey, what are you doing to help comply with CCPA? There are lots of those discussions, we're all having them. But how do we get better as companies and as industry in having the right dialogue about ethics and values consistently with consumers to drive these concepts of trust and privacy?
The way we think about it is when you're shaping the market, when you're thinking about marketplace practices, you can draw a shape, which is a triangle. It's a lovely triangle. And at the top, you've got consumers because we all want to build the products that are best for consumers. We want to compete on the basis of what's best for consumers. We're rewarded in the marketplace. So then on that bottom left-hand side, of course, you got the supply side, you got the manufacturers, the companies, you got the rule makers. Often when one of those sides of the triangle is out of whack, it's really hard to do the right thing. It's really hard to have a race to the top. So I think despite CCPA being a first draft and imposing a huge compliance cost on a lot of companies, it's good in the sense that it sort of resets the incentives, creates some disincentives. And it's part of, I think, an overall effort that we need to have together, consumers, manufacturers, policymakers, to help put the right conditions in place so that companies are competing on the basis of privacy the same way they're competing on the basis of value and performance and security and things like that. So I think that kind of dialogue is really critical. And one thing that I would encourage everyone to do is, if you're interested in this kind of dialogue, we are working on something called the Digital Standard. And it's an effort to really articulate, well, what are the right norms and values when you're looking at products? Because some of this stuff, it's harder to evaluate than value or performance, and sometimes it'll be in the eye of the beholder. So I think that kind of dialogue can be quite helpful, and I'm sure that everyone would agree.
Well, that was a great segue to my next question, Ben, because taking culture and kind of flipping it sideways from the consumer's perspective, we have generational differences in expectations. We have international differences, right? Privacy in the US is different than privacy in Europe, is different than privacy in Asia. So how does a company understand those expectations from the individuals and from the global perspective and build a product and a service and maintain a culture that addresses all of them?
So there's, I mentioned I used to be a VC, and one of the things we used to do are these unconferences where you bring thought leaders in a particular area and discuss topics based on what they nominate. We had a fairly senior engineering leader who focused on security and sort of to bleed into privacy a little bit, give us some interesting details on the generational divide and the studies that they did. And this was about 10 years ago. And they thought millennials just don't care about privacy because they'll just share anything online and it goes out there in the ether. And so they studied this thinking, okay, are we going to have to figure out how to deal with a generation of people that just don't care about privacy? And what they realized was that as people hit about the age of 27, 28, they started to care about privacy regardless of their generation. They started to clean up their social media sites, delete photos, try and find things that had been posted before, take them down, look a little bit more serious. And they realized it's not a generational thing, it's an age thing, and it's an employment thing. And when people start to go out and look for jobs, employers go and look you up online. They'll search you, they'll Google you, they'll Bing you. And when they start to see photos of you behaving like a moron in college, they'll think, is this the kind of person I want to, let handle my checking account? And so they found that it's not generational, it's age. And then internationally, the thing that has been really fascinating to me is how privacy has become part of the social lexicon now. Many, many, many more people are aware of privacy and its implications because of what's been in the news over the last 4, 5, 6 years. Starting with Edward Snowden, then we had the 2016 election, Cambridge Analytica. The hits keep rolling and these new regulations, and there's just a broad awareness of privacy, the importance of privacy, and how that impacts our very basic freedoms and our day-to-day lives that I don't think is going away. I think it will keep building. And I think the impetus is going to be on companies like us to make sure we're addressing those concerns in a constructive way.
Yeah, it's definitely in the zeitgeist, and it's probably a bit bizarre for everyone in the room who's a privacy professional or focused on privacy in some way to suddenly feel like you're working on the issue that everyone's thinking and talking about. But on the other hand, one of my favorite privacy stories is from 1991, when Lotus Software Corporation and Equifax said, we're going to put out a CD-ROM with 130 million households with their address and marketing information, and we're just going to sell it to whoever wants it. And there was a huge backlash, and 30,000 people wrote and said, no way, don't put my data in there, and they were forced to cancel the product. So in some ways, this is not entirely new stuff. It is a constant game of vigilance and making sure that the public is aware and engaged on these issues and feels that they have some stake or that they've got some ability to affect the outcome. I think the worst thing that could happen, and one of the other speakers alluded to this, is for consumers to feel like there's just nothing that can be done about it. That, everyone's already got my data, this is too complex and scary, I give up. And so I think just going back to what we can all do, everyone on that side of the triangle, demonstrating a commitment, helping people feel empowered, doing things that really do put control back where it belongs, which is the consumer. I think that is something that we can all do.
And I think there's a misconception, maybe a tangent here, but data isn't just our name and address and email, right? It's where we are and how we work out, what that video looks like, right? A lot of metadata out there that we have to think about. Get your questions ready online and in person, I think. I want to bring it back to the operational piece as we wrap up here and wait for a couple questions. Are there any frameworks, processes, technologies, best practices that you found help you get a grasp on all of these regulations so that you can actually focus on the trust versus just simply being compliant?
Yeah, I think we've alluded to several. I think, you know, privacy by design is at its core. It's also understanding that where the data is in your infrastructure. And you provided a perfect example as to one of the reasons why. But it's more than that. It's more than getting stuff that is finding that you might have something scary there. It's also just understanding the data and where it sits across the organization, across the enterprise, so that when you are providing control and choice and transparency, you're able to do that accurately and effectively.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think those are all the baselines that you need to have in your organization to get in compliance with what the laws are today, right? And then going the next step up means making sure that everybody is trained on what your value system is on privacy as a company and how you're going to approach it, both from a design perspective and from just continuing to chip away at the tech debt of, you know, companies, quite honestly, that were created in the 70s and 80s. Their concept of data privacy was what you just described in the Lotus Notes example. So trying to get, you know, those companies have some of the toughest challenges, and I think that is actually helpful for companies today to recognize that if they don't stay on top of it, it's only going to get worse. And then from a global standpoint, I just wanted to touch on that question you were asking of how do you deal with the fact that that a lot of us are creating products on a global scale and the laws are different across the globe. And again, I think that goes back to the point John and I have been making of having a baseline standard across your organization as to how you're going to approach these issues, something that goes even above and beyond what the law says.
I think that's spot on. The one thing I would add on to it is automation, because there are certain things across every geo, across every business unit that you know are going to be standard. So for instance, you never want to have credit cards sitting unencrypted. You know that. So if you ever see credit card unencrypted, auto-encrypt it. And so having tools in place that can discover those things on an ongoing basis and acknowledge the fact that data is not a static thing. It is constantly changing, constantly streaming in and out of your organization. It's a moving target. Having some automation in place to go and find those areas where you know you don't want to have those things, or you know if you've got religion information like somebody's food preference, kosher or halal, that can tell somebody your religion. And so being able to find those things, put them in secure network zones, create some of that automation in place to help address these things in a programmatic way will help a lot, because the vast majority of organizations have way more data than they can possibly comb through doing anything manually. And so you have to have automated procedures and processes in place to grab those things that you know are going to be problems and auto-correct them.
Perfect. And question here from the audience.
Is that working? Well, yeah. Jim Dyer, I'm with a startup that works on privacy for news. Would like to know if any of you have any hero products or hero people that you read, absolute favorites that you go to for yourselves to stay in touch with these issues. Thank you.
So I will put a plug in for the IAPP. I will disclose I'm on the IAPP board, but I do find the International Association of Privacy Professionals, their daily newsletter, to be a really helpful resource in terms of keeping up on what's happening in the world on different privacy issues. Also, the New York Times is doing a great piece right now on privacy, so that's another one.
Yes, my name's Craig Erickson. I'm just an ordinary consumer. And my question for the panel is, do you exercise your own data privacy rights? If so, how would you rate the job that you're doing? And do you have any tips or advice for anyone else trying to do the same?
And go.
That was such a good question. Well, I have 3 kids, so I'm pretty busy keeping track of their data privacy. I would give myself maybe a B if I was grading myself. I think the way I keep track of it, I don't read privacy policies. It's just too hard. So I do pay a lot of attention to what apps I download. I do use Apple systems. And I think try to be very aware of your privacy settings and actually put them to use.
Hi, I'm Sylvia with the National Cybersecurity Alliance. I'm going to ask a couple of questions that we're getting through our live stream, if that's all right. On behalf of @CyberWise, there's 2 questions. What's the difference between security and privacy, and is there anything distinct about these 2 topics? And number 2, how should metadata be protected in the context of privacy?
So I'll take the first crack at that. The way we differentiate between privacy and security is that privacy sits upstream from security. Privacy will tell you what's important and why, and security is the how. So for instance, you have social security number streaming into your data set. You want to be able to identify what it is, why it's important. It ties back to a policy, and then the how it gets encrypted is where security comes in. When it comes to metadata, there's different types of data, obviously. There's the raw data itself, the metadata about it. One plug I will make is that the metadata can sometimes be wrong in structured systems. You can have credit card and a phone number column because of a bad ETL job, just FYI. So the way you treat metadata, the raw data, and then the derivative data that can be built from that is all different, and it depends on the classification of the data itself.
And one other question from a live streamer, Company 1121 asks, how do small businesses show they are compliant without breaking the bank? Looking at healthcare viewpoint.
Well, healthcare will set me off on a whole nother tangent because a lot of Americans think that the health data that they give to apps and services not associated with a healthcare provider or an insurance company is secured in the sense that it can't be sold and so on and so on. But we all know that that's not the case. So I know that wasn't the question, but I just had to say that again. That's a real loophole. It's a real gap in the law that we're going to need to address.
And I would say if you're a startup in health data privacy, having done health data privacy in a previous role, get a good lawyer who understands health data privacy. It is a complex area, and it is not to be taken lightly.
And it's important.
Dave Lurch.
Final question, I think.
Dave Lurch, I was wondering what your thoughts were on compliance and venture arms at large firms. So looking broadly at the ecosystem and structuring structuring innovation and how resources get placed within the R&D pipeline, and looking at privacy compliance and those issues from that lens.
I think privacy, we were talking a little bit about it earlier, right? I think that privacy is incredibly important at a cultural level as you innovate, because that's where we want to support a lot of tremendous innovation, whether it's using AI or other techniques that are valuable and will ultimately help consumers if we do them right. And so the challenge for all of us in the industry is making sure that we're looking at doing it right and putting the processes in place, whether it's the engineering processes or the security processes, so that when we do that at a venture level, at an investment level, we're building that in without that overhead of necessarily of a large compliance organization. And some, whether it's processes or some tools that enable that are scalable, right? Because we're talking about at the venture level, we're talking about things that are scalable, both downward as well as upward.
We're good? Good. I'm just going to say a call to action as individuals. I mean, this can be overwhelming, right? We've talked about a lot of stuff today. It's not difficult if you take one small thing and take action. Pick one social network and check your security privacy settings. Do that today. Do another one tomorrow. Then it's not overwhelming. And then for businesses, same thing, right? Don't be overwhelmed with all the different regulations and all the technologies and do I have a culture or not? Just pick one small thing and do that tomorrow. So with that, I want to thank the panel for a great conversation and thank you all for joining us.